She traveled 2,000 miles for a man she'd never met, armed with a wedding dress and desperate hope. But when the wagon dropped her off at a dusty frontier claim, there was no groom waiting, just a dilapidated cabin, a shotgun pointed at her chest, and 7 starving orphans. The wagon driver didn't wait to see if she'd be greeted. He took his $2, spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the Nebraska dirt, and snapped his reins. The wagon rattled away, leaving Josephine alone in an ocean of dead yellow grass. The wind didn't blow here, it scraped. It carried a fine biting grit that immediately settled into the heavy wool of her traveling dress and the damp skin of her neck. Josie stood beside her single leather trunk. She was 26, an old maid by Boston standards, fleeing a collapsed textile mill and a landlord who demanded rent in currencies she wasn't willing to pay. Emmett Wade's letters had been her escape hatch. They were brief, terribly spelled, and promised 160 acres of proven land, a sturdy house, and a quiet life. She turned to look at her quiet life. The house was not sturdy. It was a sod structure, half swallowed by the prairie, its roof a sagging tangle of dried prairie grass and weeds. The front door hung slightly off its hinges. A broken plow rusted in the front yard next to a water pump that looked like it hadn't seen a drop of moisture in weeks. There was no smoke from the chimney. There was no dog barking. There was no Emmett. Josie picked up her trunk. It was heavy, packed with linens she'd painstakingly embroidered in the dim light of a tenement boarding house. She walked toward the cabin, her boots crunching loudly on the baked earth. Mr. Wade," she called out. Her voice sounded thin, instantly swallowed by the vastness of the plains. The front door creaked open before she reached the stoop. Josie stopped. She arranged her face into a polite, hopeful smile. But the figure stepping out of the shadows wasn't a broad-shouldered homesteader. It was a boy. He looked to be about 14, though he was painfully thin, his collarbones jutting against the fabric of a filthy, oversized shirt. His face was smeared with dirt, his eyes dark and flinty. More importantly, he was holding a double-barreled shotgun. It was leveled directly at her stomach. "That's far enough," the boy said. His voice was mid-crack, hovering somewhere between childhood and a hardened manhood he hadn't quite reached. Josie's grip tightened on her trunk's leather handle. Her heart gave a violent kick against her ribs, but the streets of Boston had taught her long ago not to flinch when threatened. She kept her chin high. "Put that away," she said, her tone flat and maternal. "I'm looking for Emmett Wade. I'm Josephine, his fiancée." The boy didn't lower the gun. From the dark interior of the cabin, another face appeared. A girl, maybe 12, with tangled blonde hair and a defensive scowl, peered around the doorframe. Then a smaller boy ducked under her arm. "Where is he?" Josie asked. The silence stretching between them was heavy, suffocating. The older boy swallowed hard. His hand shook, just a fraction, making the heavy barrels of the shotgun dip and rise. "He ain't here. Is he in town? Did he not get my telegram about the train schedule?" "He's out back," the girl spoke up. Her voice was raw, raspy. "Under the cottonwood tree." Josie stared at her. "He's... what?" "He's dead," the older boy said bluntly. He finally lowered the gun, resting the stock in the dirt, exhausted by the weight of it. "Cholera. Took him 3 weeks ago." Josie felt the blood drain from her face, rushing down to pool in her aching feet. She dropped her trunk. It hit the dust with a dull thud. Dead. The man who had sent her $50 for a train ticket, the man who was supposed to be her salvation, was buried under a tree. "I see," Josie murmured. She swayed slightly, the brutal sun suddenly feeling like an anvil on her shoulders. "And you are?" "Caleb," the boy said. "That's Sarah. Levi's behind her." As Josie's eyes adjusted to the gloom inside the doorway, she saw more movement. Two little girls, identical twins with feral, dirty faces, peeked out from behind a torn burlap curtain. A toddler, completely pantsless and smeared with mud, sat on the dirt floor. And from the very back of the room, a high, reedy wail pierced the air, the weak, rhythmic crying of an infant. 7. There were 7 children in that miserable sod house. Emmett never mentioned children, Josie said, her voice hollow. "They ain't his," Caleb said defensively. "Well, none of us are. We're his brother's kids. Our folks died back in Missouri. Uncle Emmett took us in last year." A deep, cynical laugh bubbled up in the back of Josie's throat, though she suppressed it. A dead groom and a litter of orphaned nieces and nephews. The West wasn't a land of opportunity. It was a graveyard that hadn't been filled in yet. "You wrote the last letter," Josie realized, the puzzle pieces clicking together in her mind. The handwriting had been different, smoother. "You sent the telegram, after he died." Caleb lifted his chin, his jaw setting into a stubborn line. "The bank was coming. The judge in town, he said. Without a guardian, we were going to be split up, put on the orphan trains, sent back east to work in the factories. I couldn't let them take the babies, lady. I found your letters in Uncle Emmett's box. I found his stash of cash. So I told you to come." Josie looked at the boy. He was terrified, playing a man's game with a child's deck of cards. She looked at the bleak horizon. She had exactly $1.20 in her coin purse. She couldn't afford a ticket back to Boston, and even if she could, there was nothing waiting for her there but starvation and a landlord's wandering hands. The baby inside cried louder. It was the sound of a creature that had been hungry for a long time. Josie bent down. She picked up her trunk. Caleb tensed, his hand tightening on the shotgun. "We don't got no money left to pay you to leave." "I'm not leaving," Josie said. She stepped up onto the rickety wooden stoop, forcing Caleb to step back. "Move out of the doorway, Caleb. You're letting the heat in." The inside of the sod house smelled of sour milk, wood ash, and unwashed bodies. It was a single long room, divided only by a few hanging blankets. The dirt floor was swept flat, but the corners were piled with chaotic tangles of unwashed clothes and broken tools. Josie set her trunk down at the foot of a crude wooden bed. She didn't take off her hat or her traveling coat. If she stopped moving, the sheer magnitude of the disaster she had walked into would crush her. She walked toward the back of the room where the wailing was coming from. A wooden crate padded with old quilts served as a crib. Inside was a baby girl, no more than 10 months old, her face red and crusted with tears. Josie reached into the box and lifted the infant. The baby felt terrifyingly light, her ribs prominent against her back. "When did she last eat?" Josie asked, turning to face the older children who had gathered in the center of the room, watching her like she was a wild animal that had wandered into their den. "Yesterday morning," Sarah, the 12-year-old, mumbled, looking at the floor. "We ran out of the cow's milk, and the cow dried up anyway. Caleb tried to give her flower water. but she just threw it back up. Josie closed her eyes for a brief second. Anger flared in her chest, not at the children, but at the brutal, uncaring world that allowed this to happen. "Take my coat," Josie told Sarah, shifting the baby to her hip. "Caleb, is there wood for the stove?" "A little," he said cautiously. "Start a fire. Levi, take this bucket to the pump. If it's dry, prime it with whatever water you have left in the barrel. I need it boiling." She moved with an efficiency born of a decade working in Boston's textile mills. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She found the pantry shelves, a half sack of flour, a jar of hardened lard, some withered potatoes, and a tin of coffee beans. It was poverty in its purest form. She opened her trunk. Past the neatly folded dresses and the lace wedding veil she would never wear, she found a tin of condensed milk she had bought for the train ride. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the brutal prairie in shades of bruised purple and violent orange, a fragile truce had been established in the sod house. The baby, whose name was Lily, was asleep, her stomach finally holding down a diluted mixture of warm water and condensed milk. The twins, Abby and May, were sitting on the floor gnawing on potato cakes fried in lard. The 4-year-old Ben had fallen asleep leaning against Josie's knee. Josie sat at the rough-hewn table, a cup of bitter black coffee in her hands. The house was quiet, save for the crackle of the cooling stove. Caleb sat across from her. He hadn't eaten his full share of the potato cakes, wrapping half in a rag and shoving it in his pocket. Hoarding. "You didn't run screaming?" Caleb noted quietly, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood table. "I don't have the breath to scream," Josie replied, taking a sip of the scalding coffee. "And I don't have anywhere to run to." Caleb looked up, studying her face. He was looking for a trap. "The town don't know Uncle Emmett is dead. He went to town for supplies once a month. We're due next week. If he don't show up, the sheriff will come out. And if the sheriff finds out he's dead, they take the land back. The bank owns most of it anyway. Uncle Emmett was behind on the mortgage. The sheriff already told him if he couldn't keep his affairs straight, the county would step in and take us kids. Said it wasn't Christian to let us run wild." Caleb sneered at the word Christian. Josie traced the rim of her tin cup. She thought of her landlord in Boston. She thought of the factory foreman who docked a day's pay if you coughed on the floor. Men in power were the same everywhere, whether they wore bowler hats or silver badges. "What was your plan, Caleb?" Josie asked, her voice low. "You brought me out here. Did you think I was going to put on a pair of overalls and plow the fields for you? I thought," Caleb swallowed, the tough facade cracking just a little, "I thought if we had a woman here, an adult, you could go to town. You could say Uncle Emmett went prospecting in the Black Hills. Men do it all the time. They leave their wives to work the claim. If you're his wife, you're our guardian. They can't take us." Josie stared at him. It was a massive, desperate lie. It was fraud. If they were caught, she could be thrown in jail, and the kids would end up on the orphan trains anyway. But as she looked around the dimly lit room, she saw Sarah meticulously wiping the faces of the sleeping twins with a damp cloth. She felt the warmth of little Ben leaning against her leg. She saw Caleb, a boy who had buried his uncle and taken on the weight of the world rather than let his family be torn apart. She had come west looking for a husband, for a home, for something that belonged to her. Emmett Wade was dead, but the home, battered and broken as it was right here. Josie set her coffee cup down. Tomorrow morning, Josie said, her voice steady and absolute in the quiet room, we are going to scrub this house from top to bottom. I will not live in squalor. Then we are going to go through Emmett's paperwork. I need to see exactly how much money we owe the bank. Caleb blinked, stunned. You're going to stay? I traveled 2,000 miles to be Mrs. Josephine Wade, she said, her eyes meeting his. And as far as the town of Oakhaven is concerned, that is exactly who I am. My husband has gone to the Black Hills to strike gold, and I have been left to manage his affairs and his children. Is that understood? Caleb nodded slowly, a profound, shuddering breath escaping his lungs. Yes, ma'am. Don't call me ma'am, Josie said, leaning back in her chair. If we're going to pull this off, you'd better start practicing calling me Ma. The wagon ride to Oakhaven took 3 brutal hours. The mule, a miserable gray creature named Barnaby, moved at a glacial pace, seemingly indifferent to the crack of Caleb's reins. Josie wore her best Boston dress. It was a dark blue serge, brushed free of prairie dust, her hair pinned into severe, unforgiving rolls at the nape of her neck. She needed to look like a woman who owned a farm, not a desperate spinster playing house. Oakhaven itself was less a town and more an open wound on the landscape, a chaotic cluster of unpainted timber buildings, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, and a saloon that smelled of stale beer and vomit before noon. Josie left Caleb with the wagon and walked into the Oakhaven Mercantile and Bank. The bell above the door jingled sharply. The interior was dim, smelling of oiled leather, peppermint sticks, and copper coins. Behind a heavy oak counter stood Mr. Abernathy, a man whose tailored waistcoat could not disguise the predatory slump of his shoulders. He was counting out nails for a local rancher, but his eyes darted to Josie the moment she crossed the threshold. "Help you, miss?" Abernathy asked. "Mrs. Wade," Josie corrected, stepping up to the counter. She kept her posture perfectly straight, letting the silence hang just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Josephine Wade, Emmett's wife." Abernathy's hand stopped moving. The rancher beside him touched the brim of his hat and quickly shuffled out the door, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. "Emmett Wade?" Abernathy's voice was slick, coated in a polite skepticism. "I wasn't aware Emmett had taken a bride, or that he even had the funds to support one. He's 3 months behind on his mortgage, Mrs. Wade." "My husband," Josie said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth, "has gone to the Black Hills. He heard rumors of a vein near Deadwood. He left me to manage the homestead and the children while he secures our capital." Abernathy let out a dry, rattling chuckle. He leaned across the counter. "Did he now? Men go to the Black Hills, Mrs. Wade, when they want to disappear. They don't usually leave a bride of, a week? Alone with 7 hungry mouths. Not unless they aren't planning on coming back." Josie didn't blink. She placed her hands flat on the polished wood of the counter. She let him see her knuckles white and rigid. She let him see the calluses she had built over 10 years of threading factory looms. "Emmett will return by the spring thaw," she lied cleanly. "Until then, I am the legal head of the household. I am here to review the ledger. I want to see exactly what is owed." Abernathy's smile vanished. He didn't like women who asked for numbers. He liked women who asked for mercy. He pulled a massive leather-bound ledger from beneath the counter and slammed it down, flipping to a page dense with red ink. $60, Mrs. Wade. Past due, plus the remaining principal of $200. If I don't see that 60 by the first frost, the bank forecloses. The county will step in for those orphans. You can pack your bags and go back east." Josie stared at the terrifying sum. $60 was a fortune. It was a year's wages in the mills. It was an impossibility. She reached into her reticule and pulled out her coin purse. She unclasped it and withdrew her single silver dollar and the 20-cent piece. She placed them on the open ledger. "A deposit of good faith," Josie stated, "to keep the wolves from the door. Now I need a sack of cornmeal, salt, and 3 yards of heavy canvas." Abernathy looked at the meager coins, insulted. "I don't extend credit to abandoned women." "You extend credit to the Wade farm," she countered coldly. "Because if you don't, we starve. And if we starve, your property value drops, because you'll have to clean up the bodies. Give me the meal, Mr. Abernathy." For a long, agonizing moment, the mercantile owner stared at the grim, unyielding woman from Boston. Then, muttering a curse under his breath, he swept the coins into his drawer and turned to fetch the flour. Josie walked out of the store 20 minutes later with the supplies, her knees trembling so violently she had to hold on to the wagon wheel to steady herself. Caleb watched her from the driver's seat. He saw the pale shade of her skin. "How much?" the boy asked quietly. $60, she answered, climbing up beside him. "By the first frost." Caleb looked out at the yellow plains. It was already late August. The first frost was barely 8 weeks away. "We're dead," he whispered. "We are not dead," Josie snapped, the sheer terror in her chest translating into a ferocious, commanding anger. "I survived a textile fire that killed 30 women. I survived the slums of Boston. I am not going to be defeated by dirt and a sweaty banker. Get the mule moving, Caleb. We have work to do." September stripped the heat from the wind, replacing it with a biting, relentless chill. The sod house transformed from a stifling oven into a damp cellar. But inside, a frantic, rhythmic energy had taken hold. Josie had found something in Emmett's dilapidated shed besides broken plows. She had found a loom. It was a massive, clumsy frontier mechanism, built of raw pine and twine, completely neglected since Caleb's mother had died. To Josie, it was a weapon. She ordered the children to strip the farm of anything usable. They sheared the 2 scrubby sheep Emmett had kept in the back pasture. They unraveled old, moth-eaten sweaters. Caleb and Levi hunted rabbits not just for meat, but for the pelts, which Josie meticulously washed, stretched, and cut into thin strips. From dawn until the kerosene in the lantern burned down to fumes, Josie wove. Her hands, already rough, blistered and bled, then calloused over into thick hide. She wove heavy, incredibly dense winter blankets, intertwining the raw wool with strips of rabbit fur and heavy canvas thread. They were ugly, heavy things, but they were windproof. They were survival. The children fell into the rhythm of her desperate war. Sarah took over the cooking, boiling endless pots of cornmeal mush and rabbit stew. The twins kept the fire fed. With dried buffalo chips they scoured the plains for. Even little Ben learned to rock Lily's cradle when she cried, freeing up Josie's hands to keep throwing the shuttle across the loom. They weren't just surviving. They were operating like a machine. And in the quiet moments when the loom finally stopped and Josie sat by the stove rubbing her aching joints, she realized something profound. She looked at the children sleeping in a pile on the floor, wrapped in the first blanket she had finished. Caleb was snoring lightly, his arm thrown protectively over little Ben. Sarah's head rested on Caleb's shoulder. Josie's chest ached. It wasn't the dull, hollow ache of loneliness she had known in Boston. It was a sharp, terrifying fullness. She had crossed the country looking for a husband to save her. Instead, she had found 7 broken pieces of a family that she had to save, and in doing so, they had anchored her to the earth. The first frost arrived on a Tuesday in late October. It turned the prairie into a sea of shattered glass, the dead grass coated in thick white rime. That same afternoon, Mr. Abernathy and the county sheriff rode out to the Wade claim. Josie stood on the porch wrapped in a dark shawl, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Caleb stood beside her, the shotgun resting casually against his leg. He didn't point it this time. He didn't need to. Josie was there. The sheriff tipped his hat. He looked apologetic. Abernathy looked triumphant. "Mrs. Wade," the sheriff said gently, "Mr. Abernathy here tells me Emmett's been gone near on 6 months, and the mortgage is due. Now, we hate to turn a woman out in the cold, but the law is the law. And those children—" "The children are fine, Sheriff," Josie cut in, her voice carrying clearly over the biting wind. "Where is your husband, Josie?" Abernathy sneered, dropping the polite facade. "Still digging for imaginary gold? It's over. Pack up." Josie stepped off the porch. She walked straight up to Abernathy's horse. She didn't look up at him. She made him lean down to hear her. She reached into her deep apron pocket. She pulled out a heavy canvas pouch and dropped it into Abernathy's gloved hand. It hit his palm with a solid, undeniable thud of heavy coinage. "Count it," she demanded. Abernathy's smug expression faltered. He opened the pouch. Inside was a mix of silver dollars, greenbacks, and gold eagles. $60, Josie said evenly, plus $2 for the late fee. I sold 15 winter weave blankets to the railroad camp down in the valley yesterday. The foreman bought every single one. Paid a premium because his men were freezing in their tents. The sheriff let out a low whistle, a grin spreading across his face. Abernathy looked like he had swallowed a lemon. He stared at the money, then at the dirt-poor sod house, unable to comprehend how this severe, unsmiling woman had pulled capital out of thin air. "This covers the interest," Abernathy choked out, desperate to maintain some power. "The principal is still $200. And you will have your principal," Josie said, turning her back on him and walking toward the house. "I have orders for 20 more blankets from the mining camp by Christmas. I suggest you update your ledger, Mr. Abernathy. Now get off my land. You're upsetting the dog." They didn't have a dog, but the sheriff laughed anyway, tipping his hat once more before turning his horse around. Abernathy, silently fuming, spurred his mount and followed. Josie stood in the frozen yard, watching the 2 riders shrink into dark specks against the horizon. The wind howled, rattling the dry corn stalks in the meager garden. The front door creaked open. Caleb stepped out. He was taller than he had been in August. His shoulders had broadened, carrying the weight of the farm not with terror, but with purpose. "They're gone?" he asked. "They're gone," Josie confirmed. She looked down at her hands. They were ruined, stained with dye, scarred by needles, rough as sandpaper. They were the most beautiful hands she had ever seen. Caleb walked up beside her. He looked out at the frost-covered land. It was brutal, unforgiving, and entirely theirs. "Dinner's ready," Caleb said quietly. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the word catching in his throat before he forced it out, rough and genuine. "Ma." Josie closed her eyes. A single tear, hot and stinging, slipped down her cheek, instantly cooled by the prairie wind. She didn't wipe it away. She simply reached out, placing her ruined, capable hand on the boy's shoulder. "Let's go inside, son," she said. "It's freezing." Together, they walked back into the warmth of the sod house, closing the door firmly against the wild, untamed world outside. Did Josie's fierce fight for her chosen family strike a chord with you? The Wild West wasn't just built by outlaws. It was forged by the iron will of everyday women who refused to surrender to circumstance. If you love this deeply human tale of survival, grit, and stubborn love, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates a real, grounded romance. Subscribe to our channel for more untamed frontier stories and leave a comment below.